So I'll just briefly talk about how I got into sports law. I think it's always helpful to explain sort of how you can pursue different areas of law. When I was in law school, I wrote a note for a law review on players who wanted to go from high school to the NBA. And at the time, the NBA was talking about not letting players go from high school to the NBA. And I'm a big Celtics fan. And if you're a fan of an NBA team and your team is bad, the best day of the year is the draft, because the worst teams get the top pick. It's a strange system in a way. So the Celtics were really bad in the 90s, and I knew the draft very well. And I wrote an article saying that the NBA shouldn't be allowed to ban players from high school to the NBA, that it's an antitrust violation. It was published in a law journal. My brother read it. My mother said she read it. I don't think she did. And I went to practice law, and that was it. I was practicing in Boston. Then a football player, different sport, the sport we're going to focus on today, sued the NFL over its age eligibility rule. And my brother said, hey, why don't you send his lawyer what you wrote? And I said, why would he even open the email? I'm just some random lawyer in Boston. Well, he read the email, and he brought me on the legal team. And that was how I got into the industry. It's because I wrote when I was in law school on a topic that later on ended up becoming a live legal issue. So I always say, I like to pretend that I was athletic, but my wife will remind me that I wasn't. So I got in by writing. That's really, and there's definitely a way for anyone to pursue it that way. But today we're going to talk about the NFL. And I know many of you are not from the United States, so the NFL is the top league in the United States, by far. Historically, it was baseball, but there was a shift in the last 15 to 20 years. Last year, if you look at the top 100 TV broadcasts in terms of ratings, including network TV, including political speeches, including all sports, the NFL had 70 of the top 100 events and 9 of the top 10. Only President Biden's inaugural address, which was, I think, number 6 on the list. Think about that. NFL games are what people watch. So it has become, by far, the dominant sport in the United States. And because of that, there's great interest in what happens. How many of you watched the Super Bowl? Okay, so many of you did. Most of you did. You didn't have time? You watched the halftime show was great. I mean, the halftime show was for people my age. That's really what the halftime show was for. And you saw the popularity of it. You saw the end. How many of you watched the end of the game? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you saw what happened, right? So for most of the game, the first 58 minutes, the referees basically weren't calling penalties, even though there were players who were committing penalties. And in the last 2 minutes, the referees decided to enforce rules. Now, from a legal perspective, that's sort of like saying, when do we enforce the law? Are we selective about when we enforce it? Does that raise questions of fairness? And if you're a Cincinnati Bengals fan, you probably had that thought in the last 2 minutes when suddenly the referees were calling everything. Why didn't they do it before? There's nothing wrong with it. There were players committing penalties, but if they're only calling the penalties at certain times, it raises the issue of unfairness, inequity. Well, the NFL has had a number of important legal challenges that are ongoing now. And the first one is a case brought by a former coach of the Miami Dolphins, Brian Flores. Brian Flores is 40 years old. He's a young person. He previously coached for the New England Patriots. He was a top assistant to Bill Belichick. If that name is familiar, he's the coach here in New England, very famous. And Flores was fired recently by the Miami Dolphins after coaching there for 3 years. Even though he had a winning record his last season, his overall record was slightly under 500. People were shocked because the team, although hadn't necessarily gone as far as the ownership wanted, they were pretty good. They beat the Patriots, if to the extent that's a metric. So a lot of people were surprised. Well, Brian Flores, the coach, a couple weeks after that, brought a federal lawsuit arguing civil rights violations on the basis of race. Brian Flores is black, and Brian Flores argues that the NFL and its teams are discriminating against black coaches and executives at 3 stages. First, at the hiring stage, second, in the employment stage, and third, when there's a decision to fire someone. So at the initial hiring stage, Flores argues that teams are going through the motions when it comes to interviewing black coaches. The NFL 10, 15 years ago adopted a rule that's changed over the years, but the gist of it is called the Rooney Rule. The Rooney Rule was a rule that the NFL adopted upon pressure from different groups promoting equity in hiring. The Rooney Rule requires that NFL teams interview for certain positions, including head coach, at least one minority candidate. Brian Flores argues that teams are doing what are called sham interviews. What is that? What's a sham interview? Yeah, Ryan.
Like basically already having a candidate picked out.
Yep.
And just going through the interview process and not actually considering.
Yep, so the argument, as Ryan said, is teams already know who they want to hire, and they decide to comply with the rule by bringing in a candidate, wasting his time or her time, because they're a minority. They just have to check off the box that we interviewed a minority, right? So that's the argument, is that that's a sham, that it's not consistent with the purpose of the Rooney Rule. What is the purpose of the rule? I mean, what's the advantage of having a rule that requires that teams interview a minority candidate? What are the benefits of that? Potential, or at least the thought. Any thoughts? Presentation, right? So by a candidate coming in, that candidate might really impress them. That candidate may not have been someone they were going to interview, and they really like that candidate, and that person gets the job. That's one big advantage. The other advantage is that when someone's name is reported as interviewing for a top position, that elevates their stature. They then become more likely to get interviews with other teams. Why? Because they're now seen as a credible candidate. Oh, that coach interviewed with the Giants for their head coaching position. That person must be really good. So it's a status elevation. The Rooney Rule, the criticism of the Rooney Rule is that it hasn't led to actual hiring. Now, there are more coaches who are defensive coordinators and offensive coordinators. That's sort of like the position right below head coach for offense and defense. There's much more diversity for those coaches, but among head coaches, it's predominantly, in fact, as of recently, almost entirely white. And now there's another, so right now there are 2 coaches who are black, another coach who is biracial. Everyone else, the other 29 teams, the coaches are white. Now, does that mean that there's discrimination? Well, we have to unpack it, right? Part of the challenge is that each NFL team decides which coach they want. There is a league, right? There's a league in New York that oversees everything. But every NFL team has its own owner. And that person decides who he or she wants. So the NFL cannot require that any team hire any coach or any person. If you work for a team, you work for that team. You're an employee. You work for the Patriots, you're an employee of the Patriots. You're not an employee of the NFL. So why is it that coaches are predominantly white? Well, one reason maybe is that there's very little diversity among the ownership ranks. There are no black principal owners of any NFL teams. Now, the league hopes to change that, but it's hard. First of all, there are very few people Who can afford an NFL team? The Denver Broncos are going to go on for sale, and it's expected they're going to cost $5 billion or more. So if you take the population of the world, how many people actually can afford that? It's a really tiny group. And then among those, how many want to spend what they've got on an NFL team? You're dwindling the numbers. So this is a real challenge. The other part of the lawsuit, again, is employment. So he argues that he was mistreated while working for the Dolphins. How? Does anyone know? Well, how was he mistreated? What was he allegedly pressured to do?
He was pressured to lose games.
Pressured to lose games. So he alleges, right?
Yeah.
He alleges that the owner of the Dolphins told him, I will pay you $100,000 extra for every game you lose. Why? Because, like I said earlier, sports is weird. Teams draft, the best draft pick goes to the worst team. You know, we don't say in law school the valedictorian goes to the worst law firm in America, right? We don't say the MIT #1 in their class goes to the worst engineering firm. Yet in sports, why do we do that? Seems peculiar. Yeah. It keeps the whole thing going, right? Parity is the word, P-A-R-I-T-Y. For a league to succeed, every team has to have a credible chance to win. So to achieve that, the worst team gets first dibs at the best young players. And the best team gets to pick last. So if there's a great player in college that's coming out for the NFL draft, and that player is only going to be at the #1 slot, some teams might have an incentive to lose. And Flores argues that the coach offered this, and more than just offered, resented it when he said no. And the argument is that would the owner, Stephen Ross, if this is true, and again, he denies it, so let's be clear about that. He categorically denies it. But let's just assume it's true. Flores says he would never have asked this of a white coach or Bill Belichick, right? That it's a sign of disrespect. It's a sign of thinking this is a lesser person as coach to make such an outrageous offer. So that's part of the employment as well. And then the third part is the firing. The argument is that black coaches are fired faster than white coaches. That white coaches get more latitude, more chances to win. And he points out the one black coach that has lasted a number of years is Mike Tomlin, the coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who every year their team is good. So the inference is that you have to be great to keep your job. What's going to happen next? The NFL will answer the complaint, will deny any racism. They will argue, presumably, that the facts are wrong. There was no bribe, there was no this, there were no sham interviews. He argues that he interviewed with the New York Giants, that it was a sham interview. Well, the Giants hadn't yet hired the other person. And coaches back out at the last second. There was a Patriots coach, Josh McDaniels, now coaches for the Raiders. He backed out of a job at the last second. So the Giants, the team that allegedly gave a sham interview, can say, well, we were just doing our due diligence. So in other words, there's a rebuttal. To everything in that complaint, there's a rebuttal. If the case gets past a motion to dismiss, then watch out. Then it goes into what's called pretrial discovery. Then emails are shared, texts are shared. Owners, general managers, other coaches will have to give sworn testimony. I suspect it won't get there. Why? Because the NFL will likely try to cut a deal. But it's further complicated because Flores wants this to become a class action. Class action on behalf of other black coaches and executives. Class certification is its own creature. It's its own legal process. It takes a long time to play out. I don't know if you've studied it. Very basically, in the United States, we have a model of suing on behalf of others in a class. Usually class actions are often in the context of consumer products. So I remember years ago, I got a check from a settlement. I didn't even know it was part of it. I got like a check for $7 or something. Because the bar company that I had used apparently was overcharging when I studied for the bar. And there was a lawsuit, and there it led to a class action settlement. So anyone who took that bar company got a small amount of money. If you're a lawyer, it's a good system because you get a big cut of the whole total. But anyway, separate story. So we'll see what happens if there are enough people to even constitute a class. He has to prove that. Are there any thoughts or comments on this case? Any? So some have said, is his career effectively over? Will he ever get another job? He's suing the league. So I wrote a book with someone named Ed O'Bannon. Ed O'Bannon is a former NBA player, and he was a college basketball star. He sued the NCAA. And when he sued, he knew what would happen. He was a retired player. He never again got an interview to be a coach. He never again got an interview to be a TV commentator. Once you sue a system, the system knows that. And Flores has argued that he didn't get a job in Houston, another head coaching position, because of retribution for bringing the lawsuit. So there's a lot here. This is a case, first of all, it's not going away. We live in a news cycle where things are like, okay, what's next? Cases don't do that. Cases can last. This case could be in court for years. Let's pivot and talk about a couple other major NFL legal stories. One, the Washington Commanders actually bring about several stories. They are the NFL team in Washington. For years, they were called the Washington Redskins. The name was very unpopular because that word is a derogatory word in reference to Native Americans. Now, the team had argued that it had taken on a secondary meaning, that it was not derogatory, that it was about celebrating this franchise. Some have questioned that, saying, how would we feel if other inappropriate words were used to describe teams? Would people feel as flexible? That's a debate. The team, though, didn't have to change its name because of a Supreme Court case. So there was a case, and the band actually played here at UNH Law, called the Slants. The Slants were an Asian American band. They tried to trademark their band name. And the trademark office said, no, that's a derogatory word. They filed a lawsuit arguing that the trademark office cannot regulate free speech. And the Washington team were essentially part of this case as well. If any of you have had Professor Alexandra Roberts, how many of you have had Professor Roberts? She wrote a great analysis on this particular case. She's a trademark expert, right? So she looked at how the team noted that there are all these horrendous words that have been protected under trademark law. So why is it that this band can't use that word? And why is it that the NFL team can't use that word? And the Supreme Court agreed. The trademark office cannot regulate free speech. It's not their position. It's not what a trademark is, right? A trademark is about a mark for identifying a product or service for commercial purposes. It's not about sort of policing morals. So the team kept the name until a couple years ago. You remember the start of the pandemic, right? We all remember that. Then the Black Lives Matter movement took off because of a variety of terrible things that were happening. And as part of that, the team decided to change its name From the Redskins to what? The Washington football team. Very generic, intentionally generic. And they kept that until the last year, where they said, we're going to pick a new name. But they had to do it in a way that protected their brand. They didn't want to announce to the world. Why would it be a bad idea if they said, here's the name we're going to use, before they, for instance, trademark the name or buy a website? People would copy it, right? People would squat. Squatting is the word. So the team went offshore to Trinidad and Tobago to register their name, because under trademark law, you probably have studied this, we recognize other countries' trademark registrations. And in that country, there was no public accessibility to the name, so the media didn't know about it. And the Cleveland Indians did the same thing with their new name, the Guardians. The problem is they forgot that there was another Cleveland Guardians, a roller derby team. Well, Washington didn't have this issue, and Washington apparently wanted other team names, but they were already taken by squatters, most likely. So they used trademark law, and before publicly announcing the name, they made sure they had various contracts in place for apparel, for IP, for other products and services before they announced. Now, they actually got into a little trouble because the team president, there was an interview with him and someone took a photo of him over his shoulder. And over his shoulder was a folder that had the new name. Not good timing, but that's how photographs work, right? So the team is also embroiled in a couple controversies that are interconnected. Both involve sexual harassment or worse of women that worked for the franchise or were around the franchise. The Washington team has been accused of having team executives on a regular basis sexually harass women that worked for the team, making lewd comments, asking them to have sexual relations. And the league launched an investigation into these claims. There are like 40 women. A lot of women have raised these claims. So there was an investigation, and the league issued a statement on their website saying, we found the conduct is bad. We're fining the team $10 million. Where are the facts? Where are the details? This is a league that, with a different controversy, one that's close to home here in New England, didn't hesitate to share information. Deflategate. An allegation that the New England Patriots slightly underinflated footballs in violation of the rules. That led to a massive investigation with hundreds of pages published. Details. Yet, with this investigation, with dozens of accusers, we get nothing. And you might say, well, maybe it's confidentiality, right? Maybe. Well, the women's lawyers have said, no, they want to come and talk. But they're non-disclosure agreements, so they can't. Has the league broken any laws? No. It's a private business. It can be inconsistent. It's not the police. It's not a public university. It's a private business. It doesn't have to be consistent. It can share what it wants to share. But in the last week or so, the owner of the team is now accused of sexual misconduct. And the league is investigating that. And some have wondered, could the owner lose his franchise? Would the NFL, if they found that he did it? Or, remember Miami, the owner who allegedly offered a bribe to lose? Some have said, could these owners lose their teams? Here's what we know. In theory, yes. Because the league constitution, we have a U.S. constitution, right? You all come from countries that have their own constitutions. Well, these leagues have their own constitutions too. And the NFL constitution, just like the other leagues' constitutions, say that if a supermajority of other owners recommend the expulsion of another owner, that person loses their franchise. That authority has never been used. Now, the NBA thought about using it about 8 years ago, involving an owner of the Los Angeles Clippers named Donald Sterling. Donald Sterling was caught on a recording making very racist comments about black people. The NBA explored using this authority, but someone intervened. His wife, who had a judge declare him incompetent, she took control of this. The family trust owned the team. She then sold it for $2.1 billion with a B. This is sports. This is an exciting time of. It's sort of like there's definitely an element of soap opera in a lot of sports events, but there are also really serious issues. So when we think of sports, I think sometimes there's a perception that it's just contracts and players making a lot of money and super rich owners. That's all true, but think of the things we've talked about today. Alleged bribes, sexual misconduct, racism, all sorts of really serious things that I always think the public will learn about because they're really, remember I mentioned the TV ratings. Everyone follows the NFL and other sports. It's a great way to sort of educate because it's a captive audience. Yeah, that's a good question. So the NFL, sure. The question was about, can the NFL act on its own in an investigation, or any league act on its own in an investigation? It's sort of what is the process of the investigation, right? So this raises another set of issues. Leagues have in their constitutions the right to launch investigations into teams, with or without the team's consent. And to accomplish that goal, leagues will hire attorneys. They'll hire law firms to do it. The NFL hired a former federal prosecutor named Beth Wilkinson. She is a top lawyer in D.C., former federal prosecutor, serious lawyer, all of that. But that actually raised some issues because she was initially hired by the team to do an internal investigation. And then the league said, we're going to take over because maybe we don't trust you, the team, reporting what's really happening. So in that context, the league took over the investigation. But to add another layer to it, as part of their agreement, they signed a contract, allegedly, this is what the Washington Post reports, that says unless both the league and the team agree, no information from the investigation will be revealed to the public. Now, again, there is a plausible argument that because this involves very personal stuff, it involves allegations of sexual misconduct, really serious things. The counter argument to that, though, is that in law, we use something called redacted reports. We we take names out. It's not all or nothing, right? It isn't like we have to either tell the world, here's everything that happened, every detail, or nothing. There's a middle ground where you provide some information. We didn't get that with the Washington investigation. Maybe we will with the investigation into the owner, but we didn't get that with the team. And Congress is really criticizing. There are congressional hearings going on about this, and they've been very critical of the NFL, saying, this is really serious. How have you told us nothing? The question is on legal issues impacting women's sports leagues. I will mention a case going on right now that is now at a federal appeals court level. It involves women's soccer players. So the United States has a men's soccer team and a women's soccer team. And U.S. Soccer is the entity overseeing it. U.S. Soccer signs collective bargaining agreements with the union for the men's team, and then a separate collective bargaining agreement with the union for the women's team. The women's team has historically been way better. In fact, the U.S. women's team for soccer is the best team, if you look in the last 15 years, in soccer, period, for women's soccer. The men's team has not had that success. The men's team has had promising starts, but never anywhere near it. So the women's team in the United States is better. I mean, they're much more successful. But they argue that they have been grossly underpaid. That for all their success, they're making less than the men's team that is okay but not great. Which has raised a lawsuit for pay discrimination. The Equal Pay Act requires that employers not discriminate on the basis of sex. Right? We can't have the men's make more than women because they're men. I mean, that's like, it sounds illegal because it is. But the case is more complicated than that. It's more complicated because I mentioned earlier there's a union. And this is where the women's case thus far has failed. The women's team has its own union that negotiated those pay terms. Under labor law, courts are very reluctant to stand in the place of unions when they reach agreements with employers. So implicitly, that's telling the women's players to blame their own union for negotiating a contract that isn't good. And the argument that it isn't good is that it has very high pay guarantees, but very low bonuses. That's a good system if your team isn't great. It's a bad system if your team is one of the greatest teams ever, because they're not getting the bonuses for their success. The men's team is heavily based on bonuses and very little guarantees. But it's more complicated on a couple levels. First of all, the World Cup, which is controlled by FIFA, the International Soccer Organization, determines the money that goes for the Women's World Cup and the Men's World Cup. Which World Cup do you think gets more money? The men's, by far. It's not even close. And the argument is that globally, men's soccer is much more popular. So TV ratings are higher. Ads sell for more. So the women are disadvantaged there, and they're disadvantaged on a secondary level. All of the men's and women's players play on pro teams in addition to their US teams. The women's salaries are lower. So what does this mean? It means that guaranteed money is really important. Whereas the men's team, they're already making a lot through other sources. It's like playing with two different sets of cards. And it's a really interesting case about what is lawful. Federal District Judge Gary Klossner out in California 2 years ago ruled for the men's team. Ruled for U.S. Soccer, saying, in essence, your union agreed to this. Judges don't rewrite collective bargaining agreements. The women's team has appealed to the Ninth Circuit. There's going to be a hearing out in California next month. And their argument is that a labor agreement cannot bargain around pay discrimination. Though U.S. Soccer says this isn't pay discrimination. U.S. Soccer says, well, you know, during COVID, the women's team got paid because they had guaranteed pay. The men's team got nothing. Right? Because it's bonus money. If your money is hinged to bonus performance, to playing, and you don't play because games are canceled, you don't make anything. The women's team were paid their entire amounts and benefits. So it's a complicated case. And it's a case that politicians have seized on both sides. And I don't think either side has accurately described it. It's a really complicated case. It is not what I think we're seeing. Again, both parties, I feel like they've really distorted this case. The lawyers for the women's team are the same lawyers that defeated the NCAA 9-0 at the Supreme Court last year. Jeffrey Kessler is the lead lawyer. So last year there was a big Supreme Court decision where the NCAA is the National Organization of Colleges. And some of you are from countries where I'm guessing that the system of college sports that we have where the athletes aren't paid, even though they're generating a lot of money, is very unusual. College sports in the United States are strange. In most countries, if you're really good at sports, you just turn pro. Ed O'Bannon, the player I wrote a book with, I remember he said he played in Europe towards the end of his career, and he had a 13-year-old teammate. He was making money. Why is it that we allow actors and musicians to make money at young ages, but when it's athletes, we say, oh, no, you can't make money yet. You should do the safe thing and go to college. Well, maybe that's safe, or maybe make money and go to college later. J.R. Smith is a former NBA player who skipped college, went to the NBA. He made $80 million. He's now, at age 36, a college freshman, playing on the golf team. And he had a 4.0 his first semester. I mean, college isn't, you don't have to go, life is not a script, right? You can do things at different sequences. Are there other questions, other thoughts? Yeah.
In terms of property interest, how does it work that a league can take away someone's ownership? Do they have to give them the cost of the team?
Yep.
Or they do?
So it's a great question. Under the league constitutions, if an owner loses their team, it will be a market value analysis minus legal fees that the league incurs. So the Clippers, when they were sold, the example of the team with Donald Sterling, it would have been $2.1 billion if that was the market rate, minus whatever the league paid in expenses. So, if you lose your team, you're going to make a fortune. And here's the thing. These teams only go up in value. The people that own teams now couldn't afford them now to buy them. The Patriots are, Robert Kraft bought the Patriots for like $170 million. Obviously, that's a lot of money, right? They're worth well over $5.6 billion, I think now. If they were to go, they're not going for sale, right? Because the family owns them. But like I said earlier, so few people can actually afford a team. It's a great investment to buy a team. Unfortunately, you have to be really rich first. Other thoughts? How about the Olympics? How many of you are following the Olympics? Kind of, a little bit? Not really, sort of? What do you think about the Russian figure skater?
I hate it.
Why? Tell me.
Sorry.
But that was a visceral reaction. That's what I like to see.
I'm a figure skater, so it hits close to home for me. But I think it's ridiculous. I don't think she should be able to skate. This isn't the first time that the Russian team has been accused of doping. And I mean, if you follow figure skating, if you watch figure skating, the Russian girls are well above and beyond anyone else. It's almost obvious to me. Like, I don't want to accuse them of something that maybe they're not doing, but how could you get that good at such a young age? They're all like 14, 15, 16 years old, when no one else in the world is being able to do that. Like, it just kind of is if she tested positive for a performance-enhancing drug, like, I think she probably was taking a performance-enhancing drug, and I don't think she should be able to skate, especially since, Sha'Carri Richardson of the U.S. tested positive for marijuana because she was...
And she's out, right?
Yeah, and she was out, and she was dealing with her mother's death. Like, also, I guess they categorize marijuana as a performance-enhancing drug, but I would argue it's more of a performance-inhibiting drug.
Yeah.
So, I just think it's ridiculous. I don't think she should be able to skate at all.
And the Court of Arbitration for Sport stressed that she's young, that was actually one reason to treat her more favorably is that she's 15. Although, it's interesting, we don't make age variations with other Olympic athletes, right? We don't say, well, if you're old, you get a head start, you get an extra 2. I mean, we don't do that, right? If you're an Olympic athlete, you're an Olympic athlete, regardless of your age.
Well, I think it's interesting when it comes to age because for her, I feel really bad for her as a person. I think if she was taking these drugs, that it wasn't her saying,
Right.
I want to take these drugs. It was the Russian skating committee saying, we'll take these drugs because it will help you skate better. I think she's an amazing skater, and I think she's in a really bad situation. I feel for her, but I also don't think that she should be taking opportunities away from all of these other amazing athletes that do so well. And again, if you watch her just skating, she's probably going to win, and then no one else is going to be able to have a medal ceremony. Everything's going to be delayed that's just horrible for everyone else that's there.
And you distinguish. I mean, she's in a tough spot, but that doesn't mean that she should be allowed to break a rule,
Exactly.
right? And it's almost certainly not her, right? It's some pressure to. I mean, I think now they're saying the grandfather's medicine or something. It's like blame it on grandpa, right? It's a new defense. Dog ate my homework, and now it's grandpa's medicine cabinet. Yeah, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what the TV ratings are for the Olympics, and that they were played even. I mean, honestly, I think that's sort of. I guess it's good that we've been able to have the Olympics despite the pandemic. And hopefully the next are in Paris, I think in 2024. Hopefully by then things are normal, right? Other thoughts, or I know we're almost out of time, but the league does, although it's through money generated by the ads. So, but they make. I mean, the league makes a fortune on that game, and the players, interestingly. So I write with a certified public accountant by the name of Robert Raiola. He discovered that certain players on the Bengals actually lost money by playing in that game. They lost money because if you lose the Super Bowl, you get a check for $75,000. But because of California's high taxes, and because they tax you based on number of days, if you're an athlete, you're present in the state, coupled with federal income taxes, one player loses $450 playing in the game. I mean, can you imagine that? It's peculiar, right? During the regular season, player pay varies. It depends on their contract. During the postseason, every player on a team gets paid the same. And how much you get is based on whether your team wins. So in the Super Bowl, the Rams, by winning, every player on the team got $150,000, even though some players clearly did a lot more than others. Some didn't get off the bench. By losing, each Bengals player gets $75,000. But because of California, so states use what are called jock taxes. Jock taxes are taxes levied on visiting team players. So when the Patriots go play in Cleveland, they're actually taxed for the days they're in Cleveland to play. Now, we don't do that with doctors and lawyers, right? Lawyers travel, professors travel, whatever. We don't report our taxes. I've been to different parts of just this year, or last year, I was in D.C., I was in Oregon. I don't have to pay for that just by virtue of being there for a day. But with athletes, they're actually specifically taxed. And it's only visiting team players because they're the road, we don't like them, right? They're the opposing team. So they don't really have a good political constituency. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. A lot going on in sports, never ends. Let's keep following the news. I'm sure by the end of this afternoon there'll be something else that will be breaking, and I'll probably have to go write about it. So that's the world. Well, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll do this again.